Thank you for having me. My name is Chagai Levi. I'm the founder and CEO of Iluria. Iluria is a digital health company focusing on remote patient monitoring for mental and behavioral health disorders. And the initial disorder we are starting with is ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. And for those of you who are maybe not familiar with it, ADHD is considered to be a chronic disorder with some short-term implications of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, and some pretty severe long-term implications if not properly treated. Please meet Elad. Elad is my 11-year-old son. He was diagnosed with ADHD at a very, very young age. And it was almost impossible for us to manage his treatment as we could never assess whether the medical treatment was effective or not. And Elad is not alone. Roughly speaking, 1 in 10 kids and 1 in 20 adults are diagnosed with ADHD. And their treatment processes are completely trial and error based. And actually, the reason for that starts after the initial diagnosis, because after the initial diagnosis starts a never-ending medical treatment calibration and never-ending titration process as our physiology is changing. And this stage is completely trial and error based using manual subjective questionnaires, same as it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, with some not only very poor clinical implications, but actually also enormous costs, which results mostly from loss of labor. And this is the gap that we are trying to close. We are developing a solution which will streamline the process and will deliver continuous and objective monitoring. And the basic idea is to mathematically analyze changes in physiological markers. We basically retrieve physiological markers from any smart commercial device, starting with Samsung wearables. And then we trained algorithms to basically automatically analyze changes in the ensemble of markers on meds and off meds. And by that, they're delivering analysis reports to the different stakeholders. We completed 2 clinical trials here in Israel and in the States with the Cincinnati Children's Hospital. But just to conclude the product side, let me present you with the old versus the new. So as I mentioned, the current method is completely manual, completely trial and error based, completely subjective, and super expensive. Again, mostly due to the back and forth, the trial and error, the loss of labor. Whereas in the new approach, using, basically speaking, passive measurements, we can deliver a continuous monitoring in several layers, such as more of a pinpoint analysis, meaning we are basically generating automatic or personal daily effectiveness patterns, aggregated data, meaning what happens before we titrated or after we titrated, ongoing patterns to, basically speaking, avoid unnecessary visits to the clinics and actually visit the clinic when it's actually needed. And basically speaking, completely illuminating the ecosystem and removing the trial and error element. A few words about the business with the combined value proposition of not only better caregiving, but also immense cost saving. There are several interesting silos to approach. We are kicking off in 2022 with parents as the lowest hanging fruit and to get preliminary traction, and maybe most importantly, to validate the stickiness of the solution to the parents as the gatekeeper to the solution. The biggest stakeholders are, on one hand, the pharma players. Their main motivation is, basically speaking, to enhance the adherence, which is awful in ADHD. And the second silo is that, I would say, the bucket of payers and providers. And their motivation is basically reduce labor or unnecessary labor costs. I mentioned 25% of the visits, so there is a huge motivation to decrease that. The total addressable market is actually very large, taking into account the overall prevalence, the price point, which can derive from both the cost reduction, improving adherence, improving the caregiving. And to conclude the presentation, I will describe our current status. We've done a super long kickoff phase, basically speaking, bootstrapping up to half a year ago. I mentioned the 2 clinical trials that we've done, and now we're enhancing them in Europe. We secured the IP for ADHD, and now we're securing it for anxiety and depression as well. We do hope to be in the market in Q3. Again, initially in a B2B2C mode, meaning non-directly targeting parents. And in this year, we hope to also enhance our clinical trials, both in the US and in Europe. A few words about the team. In the internal team, we have many years of experience, mostly from medium-sized companies that some of them afterwards exited. In the external team, we have assistance from computational biology experts, physicians, but aside from them, we're getting a lot of support from all of the providers or the physicians within the providers we're working with. We are very close to closing the pre-seed round. We do have an opening of 200K left. In addition, we also secured just a couple of weeks ago also non-dilutive funding from the Israeli government of 460K. And again, the basic use of funds and the basic goal for this year is to be in the market, to initiate a working level MVP, and also to facilitate the clinical trials that I mentioned in the US and in Europe. This is us. We will also leave the contact details in the chat, and thank you so much for having me.